a problem if you're not able to eat all of the time like we are now. Like back our ancestors, they wouldn't have necessarily had Starbucks on every corner.
Right.
And so once they'd burned through their about 2,000 calories worth of carbs stored, they'd have been in trouble because their brain's super, super glucose hungry and they'd have just like passed out, fallen over.
Right.
And so we evolved the ability to tap into our big old fat stores and turn fats into something that could get across the blood-brain barrier, which is ketones in this case. So if you look back at evolution, just as brains started to get bigger in different like animal groups like mammals, that's when ketone metabolism starts to appear as a real protective mechanism for the brain during fasting.
Yeah. Hey, welcome to this week's episode of the Human Enhancement Podcast. This is your host, Geoffrey Woo. And this week, we're again talking to Dr. Brianna Stubbs, our research lead over at Human. Of course, one of the most popular things that we talk to people about, and also just in internal discussions, is around ketosis. What is a ketogenic diet? How does one do it? What are tools like exogenous ketones, and how are they useful for being in ketosis? And we thought, well, we've touched upon a lot of these subjects through fasting, through supplementation and diet, through performance, through therapeutic use. So let's just actually just set the fundamentals here. Let's clear up the misconceptions. And I couldn't think of a better partner here to talk about this than Brianna Stubbs. So just a quick overview of her background. She holds a PhD from University of Oxford on ketone metabolism, co-authored a number of the human physiology studies on ketones and ketosis. So, I really consider her one of the best folks in the world in this space, and I would say that I have good grounds to claim that because I've talked to literally everyone in the space. So I think I have a good measure. So great to chat.
Flatters me as ever. But I mean, I'll do my best, and we can, like, as you say, unpack some of the common misconceptions and just try and give people some clarity, because I think, like, especially nowadays, people are getting more and more of their information on the internet. It's kind of a confusing place. So it's trying to point people to good sources of truth and providing like good source of truth here ourselves as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the internet discussion is actually quite poor in quality. So I think I think just to give some road signs on where I want this conversation to go, I think let's just define again what a ketogenic diet is, and then I think some of the interesting applications around sports performance. I think there's a lot of misconceptions there. We can talk about some of the longevity therapeutic potential around ketosis, and also some of the cognition related interesting facts and research going on in cognition and ketosis.
Yeah,
that's kind of as a rough road signs. And also just how does one get into ketosis through diet, and how does one get into ketosis through supplementation?
I think you're setting me an interesting challenge there, Geoff. That could be like four or five podcasts worth of stuff, especially,
let's dive
the amount that I
into it.
chat.
But I think let's just set up fundamentals for everyone. Yeah. So starting from the top.
I feel like the term that confuses people the most is the term ketosis itself.
Okay.
And so I think it'd be really, really helpful for our listeners if we define what in the scientific community anyway is recognized as ketosis. So if you look at all of the papers, ketosis is normally referring to blood ketone levels. So ketosis is the state of having elevated beta-hydroxybutyrate. And if you have elevated beta-hydroxybutyrate, that means that you're burning it for fuel. So that is very different and distinct from the process of being ketogenic, which means that your body is using fat to make ketones. So there's a difference between being in a ketogenic state and being in ketosis. And really until exogenous ketones came along, they weren't really, you couldn't really separate them. So if you were in ketosis, you had to be ketogenic because you had to have made those ketones yourself. But now we're advancing in the technology that people can use to get into ketosis, but that just means they have ketones in their blood and can burn ketones as energy. It does not mean that your body has made ketones. And that is one of the things that I see tripping people up the most. So they argue that exogenous ketones don't lead to ketosis. Well, they most definitely do, because you have 3 to 7 millimoles of ketones in your blood. So not only do you have ketones in the blood, but you can burn those ketones for fuel. And that's part of the reason that we think we see improved performance with ketone ester drinks, for example.
Right.
But that is like completely distinct from the state of being ketogenic.
Right.
In fact, as we've discussed on this podcast before, if you drink exogenous ketones, that even may slightly slow down for a brief period of time the process of generating your own ketones. So I think that's a really, really important like hook to hang the whole conversation on, the difference between producing ketones naturally and having ketones in the blood through a supplement or a food.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point because, again, it's a relatively novel intervention to make this actually happen in human physiology. And I think just want to reiterate to the listeners out there that in normal physiology, one has to produce ketones by your own body, by your own liver.
Yeah.
So you're ketogenic, and therefore your body is in ketosis.
Yes.
However, with exogenous ketones like our ketone ester drink, human ketone, you can actually not be ketogenic in terms of your liver producing ketones, but be in a state of ketosis, which is typically defined as above 0.5 millimoles
of BHB.
Of BHB.
Yeah.
And just to make sure it's super basic, beta hydroxybutyrate or BHB is the main ketone body that our bodies use as a fuel.
So yeah, I mean, just to follow on from that, people might have heard of beta hydroxybutyrate. That's the one that we measure using the finger prick.
Yeah.
Then there's also acetoacetate. That's another one that's in the blood, but it's more difficult to measure, so people don't tend to like talk about it so much. But it is important as well. It's less, if you look at the amounts of those two in the blood, beta hydroxybutyrate tends to be higher than acetoacetate. And then the third ketone that people have heard of is acetone. And that is the one that people measure in the breath. So if you have like a gas meter that you breathe into, that's measuring acetone.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting to just tease into the chemistry here. So beta hydroxybutyrate is a lot more stable than acetoacetate, as you mentioned. Which
is part of the reason that most supplements have beta hydroxybutyrate rather than acetoacetate, because it's more stable and easier to formulate. But,
in the Krebs cycle, when it actually starts fueling the mitochondria, beta hydroxybutyrate converts into acetoacetate. So think of, I like to think about BHB as kind of the stable, transportable version of ketones.
Yeah,
and then right when you actually need it for fuel, BHB converts into acetoacetate and then gets in and breaks down further and fuels mitochondria.
Yeah, exactly. I was worried you were going to go down a super technical rabbit hole there, but that's that's a good level.
Yeah. And I think, where does acetone come in then?
The conversion of acetoacetate to acetone happens spontaneously.
Because it's unstable.
Right. And then it's excreted in the breath. There are some pretty in the weeds metabolic pathways where you can argue that acetone might hop back in and be used in metabolism, but they're not very big pathways. Yeah. Most of it's excreted.
Yeah. So those are the three ketone bodies that people typically talk about in terms of physiology. But the listeners out there might have heard of something called the raspberry ketones, and that is
separate altogether. So
can you help explain?
To go back to the point you made initially, if we talk about the chemistry of what's going on, if we're talking about chemistry and not physiology, ketone just means carbon double bonded to an oxygen. So you can have chemically ketone compounds that are not present physiologically inside the body. So raspberry ketone has a ketone chemistry functional group, but it is not at all structurally similar to the ketones that are made by the body. I don't know whether anyone has ever seen drawings of molecules that have a hexagon or a sort of a ring of carbons. Raspberry ketones have this ring group, and then the ketone bit sticks off the side, whereas beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate are straight chain. So it's very, very different, and it cannot be broken down and used for fuel in the same way. But another reason people get confused is that there's some very preliminary animal data looking at dropping raspberry ketones onto fat cells that makes it look like this compound might affect fat metabolism in some way.
It looks like it's very poor quality.
I
would say that almost people discount that a lot. I think if you just look at the body evidence on various compounds, which we do all day long. It's very, very speculative.
Yeah, and
the dose levels are
the dose level you'd never get at in people.
And you would never supplement or eat that much.
Exactly, right? But the reason that confusion arises is that there's a name ketone in there and it's linked to fat metabolism, right, when in reality it's structurally nothing at all like.
Yeah, think of it as like a raspberry extract. Really, is what
it's a plant compound. It's a plant compound. It has this specific chemical functional group that is common to ketone body, physiological ketone bodies, and it does not act as a fuel in the same way as ketone bodies.
Well, when you mentioned that, we could dive down to the rabbit hole. I think that would be an interesting conversation for a different episode. But I think there's very interesting discussion around why ketone metabolism is different from glycolysis, glucose metabolism, how that's different from beta oxidation, fat metabolism, and how that affects metabolites in the Krebs cycle, things like NAD, NADH, which also have been interesting across the longevity research in humans.
Well, I think if there's anyone listening that, if there's anything we're talking about that kind of tickles your fancy, please comment or write into podcast@human.com and let us know, because we have these kind of conversations in the office all the time. So sometimes maybe having a fly on the wall microphone
we can share some of the thoughts. It's just an interesting thread, starting from really Sir Hans Krebs back in what 50s earlier,
60s,
who won the Nobel Prize, defined what the Krebs cycle really was. And I think why we're so interested in this space of ketosis is that it's so fundamental to metabolism, which is the fundamental creation and destruction of energy in our bodies.
But I think another thing that, again, is maybe going to be a teaser, maybe we'll talk about another time, is that ketones are not only affecting metabolism and energy production, but also affecting gene expression as well. So there's a ton of, and if we sort of shift slightly to thinking about the ketogenic diet, when people follow this diet for a while, they have changes in gene expression that equip them to metabolize fat and ketones better. And so now we're kind of interested in understanding that, but also understanding how taking ketones as a food could also do similar things. So
the buzzword is epigenetics. Right? Like, how can your environment affect gene expression?
And diet is obviously a really important part of the environment.
Yeah, which I think is a perfect segue. So ketosis, ketogenesis, different concepts.
Raspberry ketones, not a physiological ketone.
Right. So how does one get into ketosis or get into ketogenic state? So obviously the most fundamental way to do that is eating a ketogenic diet.
Well, actually, I'd argue that the most fundamental way to do it would be fasting.
Yeah.
So this is all of the old studies.
Okay, let's start with fasting first.
Yeah, let's start with fasting first. I always like to look back at the studies that were done in the 50s, 60s by a scientist called George Cahill. And it's kind of cool because back then you could get ethical approval to just starve people for days and days and days on end. There was actually one guy who he put himself on a fast that lasted
over 360 some
like
days.
A year long. And so
but this was an obese man who was like 400 pounds
lots
over
of
a
weight
year. And he had like multivitamins injected.
And water as well, salt tablets. Anyway, we're getting super sidetracked. But what these studies done on people just fasting for medical reasons were what gave us our early insight into natural ketone production. And so they saw that it takes maybe up to 30 to 40 days for ketone levels to reach a plateau, and they rise slowly over that time. Within... How
many days?
I think the whole study was 40 days long.
Right. The Cahill study was 40 days long.
Yeah.
But the plateau...
The plateau was maybe a little early. I think it was like 25 to 30 days.
The plateau for ketones is around 10, 15 days.
That early?
Yeah.
And the peak, the plateau tends to be around about 6 millimolar, which is interesting because it shows that the body has like a natural level of ketones that it kind of maxes out at. I kind of like to compare it a little bit to our blood glucose level. So I know Americans work in milligrams per deciliter, but in Europe we work in millimolar.
Right.
And the range for glucose is about between 3.5 to 5 millimoles fasted. And actually, so ketones are kind of at a similar level once you reach that natural plateau. And so the whole point is that the body has, a feedback mechanism to stop ketones getting too high, as we see in uncontrolled diabetes.
Right.
So if you fast for a prolonged period of time, your carbohydrate stores in your liver and your muscles are completely depleted. And that means that the brain is... the energy supply of the brain is at risk because the brain really, really needs glucose to keep going. And we all know that feeling mid-afternoon when you're kind of like in between lunch and dinner and you have something sugary, it picks you back up and it keeps you alert. And that's because your brain needs that glucose to function. Fat is not able to cross into the blood-brain barrier and be made as a fuel.
Fatty acids are really big molecules, doesn't transfer across.
No. So that's kind of a problem if you're not able to eat all of the time like we are now.
Right.
Like back our ancestors, they wouldn't have necessarily had Starbucks on every corner.
Right.
And so once they'd burned through their about 2,000 calories worth of carbs stored, they'd have been in trouble because their brain's super, super glucose hungry and they'd have just like passed out, fallen over.
Right.
And so we evolved the ability to tap into our big old fat stores and turn fats into something that could get across the blood-brain barrier, which is ketones in this case. So if you look back at evolution, just as brains started to get bigger in different animal groups like mammals, that's when ketone metabolism starts to appear as a real protective mechanism for the brain during fasting.
Yeah, I think that was something that I've actually been reading a lot about, and we're one of the best animals at being ketogenic in the sense that our brains are actually a significant portion of energy metabolism.
20%.
Yeah, and smaller brain animals like bears, for example, are hibernating for long periods of time, but their gluconeogenesis, the conversion of fat or protein into glucose, is enough to fuel the brain to not have to rely on ketones as much. So humans, because we have so much energy demand, our bodies can't convert enough fat, but mainly protein, into glucose, and therefore, we really needed to accelerate the level of ketones that our bodies can produce.
So fasting is
I might have opened up a different can of worms there of how glucose can be converted.
we can go into that one another time, but I think
but I think the summary is that fats can convert into ketones, and that's the main that's ketosis.
And the most rapid way to do it is just not to eat anything, because that's the quickest way to deplete yourself of carbohydrate.
Right.
And once you're depleted of carbohydrate, that's when
your body is forced to revert into using ketones as fuel.
Yeah, and another key point in the process is the absence of insulin. So if you're not eating anything at all, insulin is released in response to a meal. So if you're not eating, then you don't trigger any insulin release. And that kind of segues us nicely onto the ketogenic diet, because, we can go into a little bit more there, but the main aim of the diet is to minimize eating foods that trigger insulin release, carbohydrate. So you can facilitate ketone production. You don't have to fast altogether. You can still eat calories, but no or very few insulin triggering calories.
Right. Let's talk about some of the subjective effects around fasting, just to give a sense. I think some of the evolutionary explanations, which are somewhat, hand wavy in sort of storytelling, is the notion that, one should be more efficient and effective if they're in a starvation state. If one gets less effective, they'll starve and become stupid. So, that matches a lot of the anecdotal stories around where, as Plato had his students fast before entering the academy. A lot of religious figures fasted to get insight into how the world and how the universe was created. So there's interesting subjective, maybe, accounts around how the notion of fasting jumpstarts ketosis, which might explain some of the interesting states that humans have gone through in the past.
And if we're gonna really carry on a little way further down the rabbit hole, caloric restriction and fasting is linked to longevity, especially clearly in animal models, but also anecdotally in humans who regularly fast or go on hunger strike for religious reasons. They just live longer, and that could be because of the genetic effects of calorie restriction and ketosis.
Right. And I think that's where some of the interesting research moving forward will be, is the benefits of caloric restriction from ketosis.
As two separate things.
Which is, I think,
subtle.
Which I believe is still open science. So let's talk about a ketogenic diet. I guess ketogenic diets really came into play as a way to treat drug-resistant epilepsy.
Yeah, no, that's about in the early 1900s.
Right. I'm just wondering, did people just try to eat? So I guess there's been some discussion about Inuit tribes.
Yeah, and also
keto, just given they only could have access to heavy protein and heavy fats and not a lot of carbohydrates.
And anecdotally, they would eat the fatty cuts of meat and give the lean meat to the sled dogs.
Interesting.
But I think actually, whilst the ketogenic diet, it's broadly accepted that in the early 1900s, that's when it started being used for epilepsy.
I think that's when it's formally kind of studied.
Yeah, formally studied. But, I think it was Hippocrates that said to eat while you're sick is to feed your sickness. So fasting and, using triggering ketosis has always had a link into disease, but I think specifically for the ketogenic diet, and then William Banting as well, I think that was in the 1800s, he used a I mean, he talks about it in much.
This is South Africa.
No, he is not in South Africa. He was a British undertaker, and he was really overweight. And he'd been, he worked with his physician. I identify a bit with his story because his doctor had been trying to help him lose weight to treat his gout, and he had him rowing up and down the Thames. Obviously, being a rower, kind of identified with that a little bit. But he then his doctor was like, well, why don't you cut out all starchy foods and stop drinking beer and things like that, and he lost a ton of weight on this very, very low carbohydrate diet. The reason you said South Africa is because now there's a big movement of people following a low carbohydrate diet in South Africa, and they call it the Banting diet, using his name. But he was another early adopter, a very early adopter of the ketogenic diet. He published a pamphlet that was called A Letter on Corpulence. That's kind of funny to read.
Interesting historical side factoid. But I guess it is proper to say that studied clinically in the early 1900s, it was originally designed for treating drug-resistant epilepsy. And these diets, what was the macro ratio?
Well, I mean, as much fat as possible. So, I mean, typically under 25 grams of carbohydrate a day. I mean, ideally maximum under 50 grams of carbohydrate a day, 80 to 85% of the energy coming from fat, low to moderate protein, not a high protein diet, and a very, very low in carbohydrate.
Which I want to underline there. So most people that I talk to that talk about eating a ketogenic diet are really eating sort of an Atkins style diet. And I think let's just like distinguish between what a low carb diet is, what an Atkins style diet is, and what a ketogenic diet is.
Yeah.
Do you want to take a stab at it?
Well, I think really the ultimate endpoint of a ketogenic diet is that it triggers ketone production. That's in the name. So, I mean, without wanting to confuse people, if you're doing a lot of physical activity, you might be able to eat 60 grams of carbohydrate a day and still be in ketosis. But some other people may have to eat much less carbohydrates, like zero even, in order to be in ketosis. So if we're taking like the highest level definition, a ketogenic diet is one that triggers ketone production in you as an individual. A low carbohydrate diet, I mean, in the Western community, we eat quite a lot of carbohydrate. And so there's no like formal definition, but often around like 125, 100 grams of carbohydrate can be considered low. Typically for clinically putting people on a ketogenic diet, like a formal program, people recommend starting at 50 grams for a typical ketogenic diet. So I think if we were broadly looking to define like a target level of carbohydrate for it to be ketogenic, 50 would be an interesting place to start.
I mean, can you give a sense of how much carbohydrate that is? I mean, I've been eating very strictly keto.
An apple.
Is like 20
to 25 grams.
Right. So like basically when people say, 100 grams, like, is that a lot, not a little? It's like, like a banana or like an ounce of blueberries, like 20, 21 grams of carbs.
And the thing is, carbohydrates in not only in things that you'd expect it to be in, but hidden in sauces and hidden in vegetables. Even though you have to be careful about which different types of vegetables you choose and how much of them you're eating. To really follow a ketogenic diet and keep your carbohydrate intake under 50 grams a day, it takes a lot of discipline. And I think the point you were making is that most people are under...
I think most people are I don't want to say people are undisciplined, but I think it's surprising how many carbs are in sauces or things that you don't expect.
And vegetables as well.
And then 2, people overweight protein. And I think that's where I was trying to get to, the difference between Atkins, low carb diets with a ketogenic diet. So oftentimes people will say, I'm eating keto, I'm eating all this steak and meat and pork and fish, and it's like, cool, but you're probably not elevating your ketone levels that much because you're eating too much protein. And as we discussed and highlighted a little bit before, was that protein converts into glucose through gluconeogenesis.
Yeah, I would like to put a cautionary note on this, and maybe we could discuss this on another podcast, because I think there's a lot of fear of protein in on the keto scene, and I think the reality is a midway between people who overeat protein and trigger gluconeogenesis and people who are afraid of protein and don't consume enough. Because without wanting to go too much into the weeds, protein has an interesting effect on glucagon rather than just insulin. So it affects hormones differently to carbohydrates. So protein doesn't always equal gluconeogenesis consumed at the right kind of amount. So
Right.
it's nuanced. It's
Right.
nuanced. I think what we're trying to say here is protein is definitely a consideration, and it needs to be modulated.
Right.
But you can't overeat protein and stay in ketosis. But you definitely need to have some protein in the diet, and
to maintain lean muscle mass,
Yeah.
etc. And I think the hard part is getting enough fat content. So as you're saying, 80 to 85% of your calories from fat.
Yeah.
So just think about that for a second. That is, I mean, unless you're like one needs to be adding fat sources. So I can speak to this in experience. So I've been eating very, very strict keto for the last 6-7 weeks, and it's backed by also just doing finger sticks twice a day. So I'm measuring my blood ketones and confirming that I'm between 1 to 3 millimolar ketones. And in my fridge, I went from eating out a lot because, it's easier and it's more convenient, to cooking a lot. Like I basically have went from essentially virtually eating every single meal out to essentially cooking every single meal.
What do you cook? What's a good example?
So last night for dinner, I had a lot of, I sauteed some garlic and onions, boiled it down in olive oil and butter, and then had 6 eggs and a 6-egg omelet, and I put like a half a block of blue cheese.
Nice.
Like a lot of blue cheese, and just
nice.
melted it down. Just
really
quite good. Oftentimes, I'll also just cook down, like those like Costco bag sizes or Safeway size bag of like spinach.
Yeah.
Again, a lot of butter,
Garlic.
olive oil, and like you just like compress down like a whole bag of, this would have been like a super mega salad, and just shrinks down into a nice little bowl of steamed, oily greens.
And I think it's interesting just to highlight that you're getting really good micronutrients
Yes.
through making sure that you eat like leafy vegetables. And
Yeah.
so sometimes when people start a ketogenic diet, they end up with deficiencies because they change their diet so radically,
Right.
and they don't necessarily make sure they're having a varied enough diet to get
Right.
in nutrient sources that you need to stay healthy. So, I mean, to go back to the very, very top, it takes a lot of thought to do a ketogenic
Right.
diet well. And I know that some of the leading researchers in the field, Jeff Folek and Stephen Finney, their buzzword is a well-formulated ketogenic
Right.
diet. And, whilst I feel like it kind of, it gives them permission to point at anyone that gets a negative result and say, well, maybe your diet wasn't well formulated. They do raise the interesting point that it is very practical and healthful so long as has got the right components in it, whether calories, micronutrients, enough fat, like things like that. There's an art to it.
Right, and I think that's one thing that I think a lot of people miss is that, you eat keto, that means you don't eat any vegetables. It's like, well, don't eat the starchy vegetables. Like, I'm not eating potatoes, fries, not eating beans, but I am eating, a lot of leafy vegetables, which have fiber, which don't count as net carbs because they don't break down into glucose. Your body sort of flushes them out.
And I
as the
imagine you're
fiber.
adding a lot of salt to things as well, because eating keto can change the way that your kidneys are
Right.
handling fluids and things
Right.
like that as well.
Yeah. So, and then I think some of the interesting things, like instead of snacking on chips or something, I'll snack on pork rinds, or like these like fluffed up cheese things.
Oh yeah, those
like
are good.
like the frozen cheese,
Like moon cheese type
type things. Those are moon cheese and pork rinds are great go-to snacks.
And like salami, sausage, and things.
Yeah,
like
a lot of cheese. I think it's a lot of cheese. And oftentimes I'll just like squirt in some MCT oil
that into your coffee.
I'm not drinking any
Oh, yeah,
caffeine
of course.
anymore, but that's another. We can talk about
Another
caffeine as another discussion. But yeah, so through when I converted from a mixed diet to a ketogenic diet, a lot of heavy whipping cream, like probably like 500, 600 calories of heavy whipping cream with like probably another 200 calories of like MCT oil in like cold brew would start off my day.
Yeah. So you're making a very conscious effort to make sure that your fat content is high.
Yeah, because I think it's like, and I think the first 5 days it felt weird because like your stomach is just not used to eating that much fat. Again, like 85% fat is like nuts. Like when I'm like eating steak, I used to like throw away the fatty bits, right?
Now you eat those
I
bits.
like eat the fat bits, like especially
slab of butter on the top, because otherwise it's lots of protein.
a lot of protein.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think one can go to this kind of extreme. I don't think it's that extreme anymore. I think I'm pretty adapted to it.
A lot of people find it impractical, though.
Yeah,
and
but it's you have to take a lot of thought. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think when you think about the origins of the diet for therapeutic use, especially in children, it can be very difficult to get children to adhere to that sort of thing, and people are interested in the diet for Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases, and those people also might have more trouble adhering. So there are limitations to the diet, broadly speaking.
Yeah.
Which brings us on to exogenous ketones.
But even before that, I think it is an important point to raise. I think, we fast, and then I've been eating keto for the last 6-7 weeks, but I wouldn't say that, hey, everyone in the world should be eating keto all the time. And I think that's an important notion, because I think a lot of people in the keto community are, they get too dogmatic either way, right? And I think some of the limitations or some of the concerns that I have is that, I've been doing monthly blood draws to make sure my blood lipids, inflammation, insulin, levels are moving the right way as possible. And oftentimes, a lot of people see elevated LDL cholesterol levels, which may or may not be clinically relevant, given some of the emerging, research out there. But what does seem to be clinically relevant is your HDL levels and your triglyceride levels. So I think make sure that you track your lipids and your biomarkers if you start doing kind of different diets.
Because everyone's body responds differently, and as you say, it is not necessarily the best diet for everyone, and also it's not necessarily the best diet for everyone all of the time. Right. So recently Peter Attia updated his blog post on ketosis, and he was saying how he felt like it had been a really good reset period for him to follow it really strictly for a couple of years, and then after that he was able to reintroduce carbohydrate and felt better with less of a strict ketogenic diet. So I mean, I think it's an interesting tool, and it will work for people in certain contexts, but it's not necessarily for everyone.
Right. I mean, I think I want to give airtime for the people from the that are excited about carb heavy diets, right? Like there's also just good longevity data around diets that are just like 100% carb, like super low fat, right? So I think there is multiple ways
to be healthy,
right? Like metabolism is complicated. I think you're just hitting different pathways through different mechanisms.
Well, you kind of hit an interesting point there. I think actually what the really bad diet is one that's high in carbs and high in fat together. That's like the typical Western diet, and that's not great news.
Yeah.
But if you have really super high carb diet, low fat diet, that can work really well. And if you have a low carb, high fat diet, that also can work really well as well. And there's nuance to it. You can do ketogenic diets cyclically. You can fast for 5 days a month. There's ways of using dropping in and out of these things that we're beginning to understand now, and so it doesn't have to be absolute.
Right. Absolutely, and I think that will be the future. And I think we've talked about that, for athletic training, for physical performance training, that one will have periodized times where you focus on getting your body keto adapted and then cycling out of it. Because I know that for a lot of heavy lifting, anaerobic type exercises versus endurance aerobic exercises, you need glucose.
Yeah, so I mean,
so I think there's like a balance. Like there's no just golden, magic thing that solves everything for everyone.
Oh, of course not.
Right. So I think I think it is important that we actually talk about the limitations and constraints for all types of diets, especially keto.
Yeah, I mean, so to look at the data, to bring the science lens onto it, as yet, the low-carb ketogenic diet has failed to show an outstanding benefit in terms of performance. So, I mean, where we're at is we understand that people that follow this diet do have much, much higher levels of fat oxidation than people who follow a normal mixed diet.
Right.
That's been shown. It's interesting. There's a lot of debate in this field, and it gets quite emotionally fraught, let's just say. But some people have found that these changes can happen kind of quickly within a week of following the diet. And normally if you measure performance after a week or so, there's normally a drop-off in performance. And the people who are pro low-carb diet say that this is because you've not had enough time to adapt.
Keto adaptation takes like 6 months or a year.
Which can take a very long time. And there's not been really... There's a study that's looked at just the metabolism of these athletes, but they didn't have any performance data. So really we're relying a lot on anecdote here. And it looks to be from the data that there is change, that there are changes in metabolism. Unclear as yet how that affects super long distance performance, but it does look like there's no clear benefit at the sort of distances that are being competed in, you know, marathon, standard, you know, by standard athletes. So it's sort of one thing I suppose that is striking is that in terms of endurance anyway, there's often not a decrement. Really, you know, sometimes people seem to lose their top end power. So if you're in a sport where you might need to sprint for the finish, like most races, let's just say, you might be a little compromised by a ketogenic diet, but you know, you could still produce as much power for, you know, a 100-kilometer time trial and things like that. No difference. So that's like a, you know, kind of net interesting / positive equivalency. But the top end power, that is important for people who are competitive, and at the moment it looks like there's no clear answer yet. It does look from the data like in a lot of people on that diet for a short amount of time that their power suffers. And you know, there's a lot of anecdote out there of people who feel like they feel fine. So really I mean, I don't want to like rub anyone in the community up the wrong way.
So I think the way to think about it is that there's really two dimensions that people are talking about. One dimension is just like strict performance. I want to be an Olympic gold medalist. I want to be the best person, you know, best possible performance. And oftentimes that is contradictory, or at least orthogonal, to longevity, metabolic flexibility. There's more and more data suggesting that, if you're pushing your body to be a champion, that's probably not best for you to like live long.
No, I mean,
right?
You get
so there's trade-offs.
Big heart and people just drop dead. And
right? So there's trade-offs. And I think that I would say that in training or from a lifestyle perspective, ketosis seems to be better for the longevity, maintenance, but where in strict performance, you want all possible fuels at the same time, which includes glucose.
Yeah, and I mean, as you said, you might include periods of like training in a ketogenic state or a fasted state to boost your fat metabolism.
Right.
But it does look, you know, glycolysis and that anaerobic energy production is as important.
It's important. It's super important. It just it's a fuel reserve and a metabolic pathway that's very efficient for what it does.
But, I mean, this is kind of accounting for the fact that typically these studies have been of people using a ketogenic diet or a low-carb diet, and so that they either have one or the other. And so exogenous ketones are kind of interesting because you can be in ketosis, not be ketogenic, have full carbohydrate stores and also ketones on top, which is different again. So we've got your typical athlete who fuels with carbohydrate mainly. They'll be like carbohydrate loading before a race and taking on carbohydrate. You can take on, the recommended amount is 60 grams an hour. That's quite a lot. That's a couple of gels an hour. So it's, you know, pretty high carbohydrate intake. Or you can be a low carbohydrate athlete, a keto athlete, and anecdotally, these guys are doing the, multi-day long endurance runs, and they don't have to eat all of these goo shots. And part of the reason there is, it upsets stomach, but they're fueling on super, super low GI carbs maybe, or fats, nut butters, like fatty shakes, things like that. And now you've got an athlete that can have full carbohydrate stores and also supplement with ketones on top of that, which is completely different metabolic state because it's not just carbs or just fat and ketones, it's all three fuel sources.
And that was a lot of your PhD work over at Oxford, the notion of a ketone ester drink. So, and that's what we actually introduced to the world. So, not to overly promote our own products here, but that's what we're super excited about and super knowledgeable of this space. I mean, we've really looked at all pathways to get to this point of having exogenous ketone ester that really puts human physiology in a novel state.
It's totally novel.
You can be in ketosis, not be ketogenic, have full carb reserves, have very, very high ketone levels, and that's why, sort of a reference, when you want to win races, you want all fuels, replete fuels in all possible ways.
So I mean, say you raise your ketone levels with a drink before you go and do a marathon.
Right.
And say you're like going to break the world record, you're on for 2 hours. Say you have a ketone drink beforehand along with your normal carbohydrate. Your body then has ketones to burn, and it burns those in preference to the carbohydrate early on. But then as you get like an hour in, you've burnt through the ketones. If you don't take another drink, you're then just like on carbs, which is great as you try and start to ramp up that intensity towards the end.
Exactly, and that does not occur naturally.
No.
I mean, one cannot diet or exercise into that kind of physiological state.
No, you have to consume ketones.
So before we dive too much into the ketone ester itself, let's talk about all the different forms and supplements that people are taking today to enhance ketosis or enhance their ketone levels. So I would say that there's three broad categories, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it. I would say that there's a category of MCT oils. You might have heard about MCT oils from bulletproof coffee or fat coffee for coconut oil, and that's one category. So basically, medium chain triglycerides or fats that are readily, that can convert into ketones. And then you have more proper exogenous ketones, and they're in two main categories. First category is ketone salts. They have their limitations. And then there's the last category that we're really excited about bringing to the world, which is a ketone ester. Mm-hmm. These are the three main ketone categories.
So, I mean, just to flesh it out a little bit more, when we've given people MCTs, you see, it depends on how much you give people, and there are limits there because, especially to people that haven't taken them before, dosing up on the MCTs kind of rapidly can cause you GI upset.
Yeah, which we've seen in the office when we're doing some, small case studies. I know actually Zill, right? It was Zill. You were kind of knocked out when he had an MCT.
Yeah.
C8 caprylic acid shot.
So you take those and you might get a blood ketone raise of between 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, kind of like a small modest bump in ketone levels. Mm-hmm. Then the salts, I mean, those are kind of they've really taken off recently. People are using them and often get between 0.5 to 1 millimoles. But interestingly enough, all of the data that's coming out around sport performance and around therapeutic uses is, a bit more. There's no improvement in performance, let's just say, with ketone salts versus ketone esters.
I would even go strongly and say that they make you perform worse.
Well, yeah.
That is what all the literature published.
It looks like because potentially it's a fluid shift thing, because they're very concentrated and then frequently reported, again, gastrointestinal distress with people.
But I think the data is what the data is. I mean, people are performing worse on ketone salts, which is unfortunate because a lot of the marketing around ketone salts is making people a bit better, and it's like you're selling something that's making people worse, and like they should just be drinking water, right?
Yeah, I think probably the headline is that the elevations in ketones are so small that they're unlikely to be super physiologically relevant, and the co-delivery of mineral ions could well be the thing that's negatively impacting performance.
Yeah. So one of the things that's kind of frustrating is the right word, at least, or maybe a combination of frustrating and amusing, is that all the literature that you might have seen out there about how ketones improve performance is actually relating to the work at Oxford and some of the work that you were involved with, which is relating to the ketone ester.
Yeah.
And let's talk about a little bit about how the ketone ester works and why it's different from MCT oils, which is kind of a food supplement version, and ketone salts, which is like a 1950s technology that hasn't really panned out. Mm-hmm. Why is the ketone ester so interesting?
So the ketone ester contains just pure ketone precursor. There's no mineral load with the ketone ester. An ester just means that the two ketone parts are joined by what's called an ester bond. But we eat esters in our diet all of the time. They're things that give our food smell often. Mm-hmm. So our guts are like really well designed to like break apart these two ketone entities, and they're absorbed really very quickly and achieve very significant boosts in blood ketone levels. I mean, maybe upwards of 3 millimoles. I took it the other week and got to 7 millimoles. So it's a much bigger rise in ketones, much quicker than
it's like
with
5 to 10x
salts.
stronger than ketone salts.
It's very strong, and there's no mineral load. It's very easily absorbed, and because this compound that I worked on in Oxford, we've been refining it over a long period of time. There's broadly no tolerability issues at the doses that we're giving. Right.
Yeah, that's cool. So I think, in a nutshell, then I would say that the downsides are that it's still relatively expensive. We're working on bringing the cost down as quickly as we can, and it tastes kind of crazy. But other than that, like cost and taste, it's 5 to 10x more potent than MCTs and ketone salts. And I think the coolest part is there's actually a robust body of data showing that it enhances and improves athletic performance in the ways that are relevant.
Yeah, I think a lot of the discussion around ketosis generally, it focuses on the whole area, and it doesn't distinguish between firstly exogenous and endogenous ketosis, which is an important point, and then often it doesn't tease much into what level is needed to get the desired effect.
Right.
So it just lumps everything
Like
together.
I think in a lot of cycling studies, people are up at like 5-6 millimolar.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Like that's what you.
Well,
need.
I think they would be at 5-6 millimole if they were at rest. During exercise, it's more like 3.
Right.
So you have to give more because the body's burning it.
Yeah.
So, but we are starting to get a really deep understanding of how to give ketone esters alongside carbs and
Yeah, for
as
a lot of
performance
populations
thing,
now,
recovery
and,
thing.
with military, with with cyclists, with other types of sports. I mean, I think we're just building a lot of domain expertise here as we're just working with people and professionals, really world-class people in all sorts of endeavors.
Yeah, I think it has been one of the biggest challenges though is like educating people and getting people to discriminate between diet and supplements and foods and all of these. There's a lot of nuance there, and so education is something that we're taking really, really seriously moving forward.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the research also is just exciting. So I think, something that you teased upon earlier in this conversation was that it's not just, beta-hydroxybutyrate is not just the metabolic substrate, not just the fuel for the Krebs cycle. It also has potential interesting signaling effects for things associated with longevity, things with inflammation.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, and it's cool to have a tool as powerful as the ketone ester that allows us to separate ketogenesis and low carbohydrate restriction from ketosis and the effects of beta-hydroxybutyrate and ketones themselves.
Right.
And we're excited to see where that goes in the future.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's like why I think one of the interesting ways we talk about, ketones and ketone esters is that we really think about it as a fourth macronutrient, right? So a lot of the ketogenic diet studies essentially conflate high-fat diet plus presence of ketones, and there might be some downsides or trade-offs between that kind of state, where with a ketone ester diet you can break apart the need to eat high fat and have ketones in your
it's
system.
interesting. So I was reading a paper recently, and it talked about how the mitochondria, which is the energy producing part of our cells, how they make energy when you're on a ketogenic diet, and there are some things that improve the health of the mitochondria and some things that make it a little less efficient. But we don't know yet what would happen if it's like if you're not eating that high fat diet, whether you just put ketones in. And we've seen in animal isolated rat heart that there's an improvement in efficiency of that muscle when you just give it ketones. That's not a diet. So we wonder whether just supplementing with ketones would give you the improvements in efficiency without the negative effects of the high fat diet in terms of.
Which is why I think that opens up an interesting possibility, right? I think, can you get the benefits without the drawbacks?
Yeah, I mean,
I think it's early, but I think what is there is that it's very, very safe, low side effect profile. It is a food component, not a supplement, not a drug. This is a food, and it really, I think, serves as a fourth macronutrient.
And it's, and it allows people who are on a ketogenic diet to give themselves a boost in ketones, which might help them adhere to the diet. And it also allows athletes or people that are not following a ketogenic diet for performance reasons to have this extra fuel source and maximize fuelability during exercise.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was going to kind of wrap up there, but I think you open up an interesting point before we wrap up here, which is that a lot of our early customers are using it as an adjunct to do longer fasts, because actually, you actually published this paper, ketone ester drinks reduce ghrelin, reduces appetite, and this is not insulinogenic, doesn't so it's like one of the perfect crutches if one needs a crutch to extend a longer fast.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
A lot of exciting data. I mean, it's a fascinating space, and I think we're both just super excited to play a small role in further understanding it and further educating people.
Yeah, lots to do.
Yeah. So hopefully, as we wrap up here, this is helpful to kind of clarify a lot of the misconceptions or just nuances within ketosis, ketogenesis, ketogenic diets. If there's any areas that we teased upon that we didn't have enough time to dive deeply into, just send us a note. We're both on Twitter. Brianna is at Brianna Stubbs. I'm at Geoffrey Woo. But also just email us, podcast@HVMN.com. I think we all read every single one of your comments. We love them. And if you want to do an extra favor and show us some extra love, give us a 5-star review or whatever star review that we deserve. Send us a screenshot of that to zill@podcast@human.com, and we'll send you a free Sprint Mini, which is our acute nootropic product. That's all for now.
Great to chat again.
Great to chat, and see you guys next week.
Have a good one.
Bye.